And I understand that. I get it. Especially the way the culture is now. It's always been a little intimidating, but now it's a lot worse. And so consequently, you're not going to get into play, and you're going to sit on the bench. Well, I don't think that's the wisest approach, what we did 50 years ago. And what I want to do is I want to give you an insight that has really significantly affected my entire approach to engaging people with the truth. And I engage people a lot. But my approach is very different. So I'm going to give you an aphorism. It's like a statement that really guides my thinking. And in a way, it's very simple, but once you see the role it will play maybe in influencing your approach, you'll see how profound it is. Here's the aphorism. Write this down. Before there can be any harvest, there always has to be a season of, let's just call it gardening, all right? Before there can be any harvest, there always has to be a season of gardening. Now, this is obvious in agricultural terms. It ought to be obvious also with regards to evangelism. Think of Jesus in John chapter 4. There's a woman at the well, famous account, a lot of sermons about that aspect, but I want to talk about what happens just after that. She goes off to Sychar, and the apostles come up to Jesus. And Jesus says to the apostles, you say there are 3 months and then comes the harvest. I'm saying look on the fields. They are white with harvest. Now, I don't think Jesus was saying that every field is always white with harvest. We know better. I think he was saying Sychar is white for harvest. And he says, you are about, watch the words, you are about to reap where you did not sow. You are about to reap where you did not sow. And so the proverb is fulfilled, Jesus says, one sows, another reaps. Now, I want you to think about what he says. What Jesus did is he identified one field, in that case, Sychar. But there were 2 seasons, sowing and reaping, gardening and harvesting, and 2 kinds of workers, sowers and reapers, gardeners and harvesters. And each is absolutely necessary. The disciples were coming into a circumstance where someone had done the gardening that was necessary. These folks were ready, and we saw a strong move towards Jesus as a result. And Jesus is telling them, you're going to reap here, you're going to harvest because the fruit is ready. I want you to think something about harvesting. 1973, September 28th, I became a Christian. My younger brother, Mark, was the one who was gardening a lot in my life at that time. And he came over to my apartment, and he began to tell me more about Jesus that evening. And I told him, Mark, you can stop talking about Jesus because I've already decided I want to become a Christian. It took me about 15 minutes to peel him off the ceiling, and then I prayed a prayer, began to follow Christ. Okay? Notice, in my case, the fruit was ripe. What did Mark have to do? Nothing. He bumped up against the fruit. It fell right into the basket. Ripe fruit is easily harvested. When the time is right, bang, it happens. And many of you probably here can think of your own stories. In many cases, there wasn't even anybody with you. It was the influence of the gardening in your life by other people, your pastors, your friends, your family, whatever. And you came to that moment of putting your full trust and commitment in Christ. That's what Jesus is talking about. Not as a hard-pressing evangelist going for the gold, trying to get somebody to sign on the dotted line. Some of you do that naturally, you're fine. But for most of you, I think if that's what's expected of you, you're going to sit on the bench. Okay? But I said to her, let me see if I understand your view. If I had a 2-year-old standing next to me who had been conceived by incest, then on your view, I should be allowed to kill this baby. in their shoe. In fact, whenever I speak to a non-Christian audience, at university, for example, this is the way I always start. I say, I'm here tonight because my life has been deeply changed by an ancient teacher. His name is Jesus of Nazareth. And 40-some years ago, while a student at UCLA, I made a decision to follow him because as I thought about the things that he said about the world, reality, claims he made about himself, the claim that he made on my own life, I finally came to the conclusion that Jesus got it right, that the smart money was on him, and I began to follow him. It hasn't been easy, I tell them, but it's been reality. And then I say, but I'm not here today to convert you. Collective sigh of relief. I have a different goal. Here's my goal. I tell the audience, I just want to put a stone in your shoe. I just want to annoy you. They all start laughing because they expect the Christian to annoy them. All right, I'm your guy. But you're going to thank me, I hope, when we're done. I just want to annoy you in a little way. I want you walking out of here with something that I've said sticking at you. I want to get you thinking. And by the way, in any conversation that I'm having with somebody, that's my goal. My goal is to just do a little, what's the word? Gardening. I just want to give them something to think about, something to commend Christianity to them, something maybe to correct a misunderstanding, something to cause some doubt in their own point of view. I just want to do a little gardening. I want to put a stone in their shoe. And at this point in the conversation with the witch in Wisconsin, she stops after I gave that illustration and asks that question about the 2-year-old. On your view, I should be able to kill this 2-year-old, right? And she paused for a long time, and then she says, I'd have mixed feelings about that. And I'm thinking, good, at least they're mixed, you know. Now, I notice that the line is growing behind me, right? And I'm interfering with her work product. And so I know that the opportunity for my conversation, my gardening, is finished. Now, had I been of a different way of thinking, I might have thought to myself and said to the, look, I haven't got to the gospel yet. Sit down, shut up, maybe you learned something, and off I go. But you see, I wasn't under that pressure. I wouldn't consider myself a failure if I didn't get to the gospel, if I didn't challenge that person to receive Christ. In that case, I would have been jerking on fruit that wasn't ready to be harvested yet. It might have caused more harm than good. And so with this goal of just putting a stone in their shoe, I pursued the conversation. And by the way, I want you to notice something about that conversation. I asked 9 different questions. I asked questions to get information from her. I asked questions to understand her point of view. I even used questions to exploit what I thought was a weakness or a flaw in her view. And this is the power of the tactical approach. And notice in this circumstance, I wasn't doing any work. She wasn't doing any work. We weren't fighting. We weren't banging heads. We weren't guarding turf. There were no lines drawn in the sand. We were just having a friendly conversation. And that's exactly the way I want it. And this is the power of taking a tactical approach. Now, I want to introduce the basic concept of the game plan to you. I'm going to go in a lot more detail later this afternoon. I hope you come to the conference. If you haven't planned on doing so, I hope you change your plans, okay? Because that's when I'm going to give the full-throated game plan that will help you to maneuver in any conversation really well. But there's a core tactic. We have tactics called suicide and take the roof off and just the facts, ma'am, and steamroller and inside out and what a friend we have with Jesus and sticks and stones. These are all maneuvers that will help manage a conversation. They're not to manipulate people. That's not the point. To help you manage the conversation. But there is one tactic that is the core of the game plan that the other tactics serve. It's the simplest tactic imaginable to allow you to stop a challenger in their tracks, to turn the tables, to get them thinking, and to put you in the driver's seat of the conversation. And that's the goal of the tactical approach. You want to be in the driver's seat of the conversation. And this tactic has a name, and the name of the tactic is Columbo. Now, I run a risk here, looking at all these young faces. How many people who know who Lieutenant Columbo is? Bravo! Oh, that warms the cockles of my heart. He goes back 40 years ago on television, but he was a detective. He had a trench coat like this, looked like he slept in it. I got mine from the Salvation Army. My wife says whenever you buy something from the Salvation Army, you always got to check the pockets because you never know what you're going to find when you... Wait a minute, what's this? Oh my gosh, look at that! Lieutenant Colombo has a cigar. Now look it. This is plastic, no worries. In fact, I hate cigars personally. Whenever I find a real cigar, I always destroy it. By fire. I'm not going to go there, though. He also had a pad of paper, right? Can't use his pad of paper. Why not? Because he doesn't have a pen or pencil. He's got to bum that off of somebody. He's wandering around scratching his head. I mean, this guy doesn't look like he can think his way out of a wet paper bag. He's stupid. But he's stupid like a fox because he's got a plan, right? At some point, he'll put his hand to furrowed brow like he's deep in troubled thought, and he'll say something like this. I don't know. There's something about this thing that bothers me. Do you mind if I ask you a question? So he asks the question, right? Gets the answer back. You're very intelligent. Ah. One more thing. And then he one more things him to death, right? Question after question. They start getting annoyed, even upset. He said, I'm sorry, it's because I'm asking all these questions, but I can't help it. It's a habit. And this is a habit that you ought to get into. The key to the Colombo tactic is that the Christian goes on the offensive in an inoffensive way with carefully selected questions that advance the conversation. Let me say that again. The key to this tactic and the entire tactical approach, to the entire tactical game plan, is that you go on the offensive in an inoffensive way with carefully selected questions that advance the conversation.
Good. I'm not getting my sound back in my monitor is what it is. So I need to figure that out here in a little bit too. And this is a practice day. And the Apologetics Conference gives us something to deal with.
Help them to work through these 5 different facts about the Bible to establish that it is not unreasonable for us to believe what the Bible has to say. But I want to talk about first, number one, some of the false claims about the Bible. The first false claim about the Bible that I want to talk about is the one of scientism, or the idea that only science provides us with real facts. There's a book by Jerry Coyne called Faith versus Fact that came out just a few years ago, in which he basically says the only facts that we should believe are those that can be scientifically verified. Therefore, religion is faith that has no evidence whatsoever. And now, there's a serious problem in what he says there just at the foundation. Because on what scientific basis do you make the claim that you should only believe that which you can scientifically verify? You see, it's a self-defeating claim that he's making at that point. He cannot scientifically verify that the claim he's making that you should only believe scientifically verifiable things is the arbiter of truth. But he's actually got a self-defeating claim. You see this in Richard Dawkins, this idea that only science provides real information and real facts. He says that they told me again that I'm ignorant of theology. He said, give me one theological fact and I'll learn it. Do you see what he's saying right there? That if it's not scientific, it's not a fact. That's a truth that people believe. It's a falsehood, but it's something that people believe to be true. Tell me one theological fact and I'll learn it. He's saying there is no theological fact because only what is scientific is to be considered fact. That's a lie that people believe about the Bible. The second one is this. The second one is that the books of the Bible were chosen centuries after the events they describe and therefore are unreliable because we don't even know why they were chosen, where they came from. It was probably a big power play. This was a Da Vinci Code type idea and many others before that and after that. That's a common lie that people believe. And the last one I want us just to think about and be aware of is that the Bible has been edited and it has been corrupted to the point that we cannot believe what it has to say. Those are three assumptions that many people have about the Bible that are completely false. You have to be prepared to engage those false assumptions about the Bible. So with those in mind, let's look at 5 facts about the Bible that you can use to work through with people that you have talked to, spoken with about the gospel to help them to believe. So 5 facts about the Bible. You want to look at these, I'm going to give you a graphic for each one of these. The Bible is a story. The Bible is history. The Bible has eyewitnesses behind it. The Bible is grounded in its authority on the resurrection, and the Bible has been sufficiently preserved. 5 facts. If you can get those 5 facts in your mind in such a way that you can articulate them to someone else, then you are able to articulate the truth of the Bible. The story, history, eyewitnesses, resurrection, and preserved. Those are the 5 facts that I want to make sure that you get. Now, as I introduce each one, I'm going to give away a book. So we got 5 of these, and so who wants Greg Koukl's new book? All right, I see some hands first over there. Watch out, because I've got it. There we go. Oh, there we go. All right, we got it. So there we go. It's actually a really good book. Greg Koukl's new book. It's really, really good. Excellent book. So we're going to toss one of these out, a book out, as we go through each of these 5 different points. So number 1 is story. The Bible is a story with a center. Here's the truth I want you to get. The Bible is a single story written over more than 1,000 years in a variety of genres that's been fulfilled in Jesus. The life, death, and resurrection of Jesus are central. Here's why I want you to get this truth. If you do not get this truth, your apologetics and your evangelism will be a bad game of Bible trivia. Because that unbeliever will say, well, what about this? Well, what about this? Well, what about this? What about this? What about this? And eventually in all their what about thises, there'll be something you can't answer, and they'll be like, all right, it must not be true because you couldn't answer every... No, it doesn't mean it's not true. It means that you just played a bad game of Bible trivia, and you happen not to know all the trivia, nor do I, nor does anyone. But here's what we have to be able to do in terms of our tactic in dealing with somebody like that. To be able to say, you know what, I can't answer every question. I can't. And I don't pretend to be able to. But my faith is not grounded in my capacity to know the answer to every question. My faith is grounded in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. You go there and work outward from there. That will save you so much trouble, so much time, and help you to focus on the right things in your apologetics if you'll simply learn to make that turn. Because otherwise, there's all these questions that none of us can answer all of them. Sometimes there aren't any answers to some of the questions. But if we keep turning the conversation to Jesus, to his life, death, and particularly his resurrection, if we do that, then we can direct people into the right place. Here's what else it helps with. It helps with some questions like those that I put up there, all of which are questions that actual students have asked me at some point or another. Sure, Leviticus says that homosexual sex is wrong. It also says it's a sin to eat shrimp. Anybody heard a variation of that? Okay, I've heard some variation of that over and over and over. Now, we got to grant there's something they've got a little bit right there. Sometimes we go to the wrong text to get the right truth. Don't go to Leviticus when you're trying to help somebody to articulate a biblical view of sexuality. Instead, go to what the followers of Jesus and Jesus himself said, and they tell you everything you need on that. Now, you can help them understand later how the Old Testament's fulfilled in Jesus. Some things have changed, some things have not. That's at a later time. But when you're initially engaging with some, look at the text of what Jesus gives in Matthew chapter 19, the clearest expression of the options for followers of him. That he talks about celibacy, 2 different types, and then he speaks of marriage, and he speaks of those in Matthew chapter 19. Romans 1, 1 Corinthians 6. We have to look at those things. And what does that do? It turns it toward Jesus. You see what I'm telling you there? Always turn it toward Jesus. Even when you get these questions, turn them toward Jesus. It also helps us to help people when they say something like the Bible's filled with all sorts of awful, immoral things. And they somehow think that the Bible is like Aesop's fables, that it is supposed to give us a moral truth that's supposed to be positive in every single chapter. But the fact is, much of what is said in the Bible is so that you don't do it. Not so that you do something, but so that you don't do it. And to understand that, we have to see the centrality of how it's fulfilled in Jesus. There are horrific things in the Bible. And the Bible rightly records what happens even when what happened wasn't right. But it's fulfilled in Jesus. All those horrible things you see in the book of Judges, for example, which is kind of the low point, most awful point morally of Israel that's expressed in the Bible in some ways. What do we see in that? Well, the fact is, in Judges, they needed a king. But even after they got a king, the king didn't work out. And the king didn't lead them into righteousness. What is all that doing? It is trying to help us to understand that we need a king who is no human being, who is not merely a human warrior, but we need a king who is God himself, and that king is Jesus. That's what it's telling us. But we only see that if we see Jesus as central in our apologetics. Let's go with the second one. Second one of these is the evidence for the truth of the Bible is primarily historical. I got a book called Truths You Can Trust from Southern Seminary. I cannot toss it far. It's heavy. Okay, so somebody toward the front. All right, there we go. One of you can fight over it right there. So we've got this book, Truths You Can Trust, really good book, just a basic primer on all the different truths of the Christian faith. The evidence for the truth of the Bible is primarily historical. Now, one of the things we often get is something to this effect, is something where somebody will say something like, you know what, you can't absolutely prove what the Bible says is true. You can't prove it. Science can prove certain things absolutely true, but you can't prove that the Bible is absolutely true. And what they mean is, in essence, you can't prove it beyond any possible capacity to doubt it. You know what? They're partly right. They're not entirely wrong on that. Anything that happens in history is by definition past. You can't replicate it. You can't repeat it over again, and there's some way you can doubt it. I had an uncle who believed to the day of his death that the entire moon landing was faked at a military base he had been at in somewhere out in New Mexico, and he believed that to the day that he died, okay? You can doubt something. You can find some reason. There is a group of people, if you look them up on the internet, who deny the existence of Finland. There's Finland deniers. They don't think Finland exists. They just totally deny. They come up with some reason. Things can be doubted. And I use the example of the birthplace of Abraham Lincoln. About a couple hours south of where I live in Louisville was where Abraham Lincoln was born, or was he? How do you prove that Abraham Lincoln was born? How do you? What's there? Talk back to me about this. How do we know Abraham Lincoln was born there? How do we know this? How do we know? Documents. But can documents be forged? Of course they can. What else? There's no DNA. Witnesses. And the testimony from witnesses. Do witnesses ever lie? Of course they do. But how does history work? We take a bulk of evidence that makes the most sense of a particular set of events, don't we? We do it all the time. That's how things work. This idea that something has to be scientifically provable is a ridiculous notion that nobody actually lives that way. Because millions of people go every year to Abraham Lincoln's birthplace, and we assume that as a fact, and rightly so. History is the way we demonstrate things. And I wish we could spend a lot of time on this, because this is one of my favorite topics, but I want to look briefly at how we do history, just very briefly at how we do history. How do we know what has happened historically? Now, there's no certain set of rules as to how you do it, but there are some different principles that you use in history. Now, to help us think about these, I want to tell you about a real historical event that happened on March 3rd of 1876. Promise you, I am not making this event up. Happened between here and where I live in Louisville, in Kentucky, in Bath County, Kentucky. 1876, no airplanes, nothing like that. And there's a woman who was out making soap on her front porch, and meat started falling from the sky. It fell from the sky for about 20 minutes. By the time it was over, they gathered up a half bushel at least of meat that had fallen from the sky. Now, there is no one that denies this event actually happened. There are all sorts of reasons to believe it happened. But nobody knows how or why it happened. The best explanation anybody has is that there are certain types of vultures that if they are frightened, they vomit. And so perhaps an entire flock of vultures had gorged themselves on a goat and they had vomited at the same time is the best anybody's been able to do in explaining this event. It's a ridiculous event, but it happened. It happened. There are all sorts of reasons to believe that it happened. In fact, the meat is still kept at Transylvania University to this day. It is still there to this very day. This is a very important historical, my favorite historical event outside the resurrection is the Kentucky meat shower. I'll just tell you, it's just the greatest thing ever. It is, that actually happened in history. Now, why do we believe such a ridiculous event? Multiple witnesses. There were multiple witnesses. There were independent sources who said the same thing but said the same truth in different ways. There were sources with nothing to gain by telling the story that they told. The sources are contextually credible. What that means is if you go back to the sources that tell about this was in the New York Times, it was in every newspaper in the United States, though every major newspaper within days of it happening in March 3rd of 1876. But they would describe the exact locations in ways that were credible. They'd been there. And with testimony, all of which was recorded while the eyewitnesses were still alive. You know what? We have all that in the New Testament with the truth of Jesus. There are multiple witnesses to what happened that don't all tell the story in the same way. Don't be distressed or troubled by the slight variations between the Gospels. Rather, see those as evidence of truth, because the same events are being described by different people in different ways and yet articulating the same truths. They're independent of each other. Sources with nothing to gain. All you had to gain by articulating the truth about Jesus, what you believed was death, was social disenfranchisement, was torture at times. You had nothing to gain. Sources are contextually credible. Let me tell you one fascinating thing in your Gospels you may never notice. Up and down. Up and down. See, they always say they go up to Jerusalem. They say they go down to certain locations. They go up and down at times. Up the road and down the road. And you may think, why on earth does that matter? Here's what's fascinating. They never get it wrong. In other words, geographically, what actually to this day is still up and down is exactly what they described. Now, there were no topographical maps in the first century. There were no sources that described in detail the geography up and down of Galilee, of Samaria, and Judea. There were none. The only way you know up and down on the road and get it right is if you've actually been there, or somebody tells you the story who was. That's crucial. That makes a contextual credibility. That says somebody in some other place is not fabricating this at some other time or in some other location who has never been there. These are people who have actually been there in these locations. And every source we have in the New Testament was written while there were still eyewitnesses alive. Every single one. Now, if we are to compare that to Alexander the Great, for example, what we find is actually there's better evidence for Jesus than for Alexander in terms of the biographical sources. Alexander's 5 accounts written by eyewitnesses, one written soon afterward, but none of those survive, except in quotations that are included in later works. Whereas with Jesus, we have 4 accounts written while eyewitnesses are alive, all of which, of these 4, all of those have survived to us today in some form in copies. Not the originals, but copies of them that are very early copies of the text. You have good evidence for Jesus. So let's look at a third one of these that leads directly from that, and that is the issue of eyewitnesses. Eyewitnesses. All right, I got a book called 10 Commandments of Progressive Christianity. There you go. All right, great. By Michael Kruger, great book about progressive Christianity, how it degrades and downgrades the truth about Jesus. And it's how do we get the books that we get? How do we get them? And the truth is that the books of the New Testament were received as authoritative because they could be connected to eyewitnesses or close associates of eyewitnesses of the risen Lord Jesus Christ. That helps you to answer the question that people have often. Weren't these books chosen hundreds of years later? And that's actually a myth that comes from the Middle Ages. Let me tell you the myth from the Middle Ages. It's a great myth. It's totally false, but it comes from 9th, 10th century, somewhere around in there. I know it's preserved in a work called the Synodican Vatum. And in this work, they piled all the books that might be part of the Bible on a table, and they prayed at the Council of Nicaea. And all the books that didn't belong in the Bible fell through the table on the floor, and the ones the Bible was made from those that stayed on top of the table. That's this myth that comes from the Middle Ages. And it's just this great myth, but it's totally false. I'd love it to be true, because here's what I would do. If one of my kids was lying, I'd line the kids up on the coffee table, and I'd pray and see who falls through the table. And I just think that would be great. Wouldn't it if that actually works? It doesn't work, but this is a myth. People still believe this myth today. But the truth is that the books that are in your New Testament are there because they could be kept connected to eyewitnesses or close associates of eyewitnesses. That's why those texts are there. I could give you a lot of documentary evidence for that, but I'll only give you one from a document called the Muratorian Fragment. There's a book they're wanting to include in the authoritative books called Shepherd of Hermas is the name of the book. And here's what they say, we can't include that, and here's why. It's written after the time of the Old Testament prophets, and it's written after the time of the apostolic eyewitnesses. Therefore, it cannot be read publicly with the books that are authoritative. What does it tell us? That's how they're making it. That's how they were saying, look, this cannot be, because we remember when this book was written. We know who wrote it, and this book cannot be included because of the fact that it cannot be traced back to an eyewitness or close associate of an eyewitness. And those are the only books we're to read as authoritative. Now, that's why some books they did have arguments about. They had arguments about Hebrews, because Hebrews doesn't say who it was written by. It ends up becoming part of the authoritative books because it mentions in chapter 13 Timothy. They knew Timothy was associated with Paul, who was an eyewitness of the risen Lord Jesus. So it gets included. But every book in the New Testament had to be connected to an eyewitness of the risen Lord Jesus somehow. Words. We have Peter's testimony in the Gospel of Mark, and we know that from an early source in the 2nd century, as well as 2 other sources later in the 2nd century. Every text in your New Testament comes from somebody who was either an eyewitness or a close associate of an eyewitness of the risen Lord Jesus. Let's take a look. Let's go to the next one of these. Resurrection. Great little book has come out from Christian Focus called How God Preserved the Bible. Anybody want that? All right, good deal. I don't think we've gone over here yet. Sorry about that. Let's take a look at the resurrection of Jesus, the centrality of the resurrection. Why I believe the Old Testament books is because Jesus believed the Old Testament books. When it comes to the Old Testament, that's why you believe the Old Testament books, is because Jesus did. And on the basis of the evidence we have that we'll look at in just a moment, there are good reasons to believe Jesus was raised from the dead.